Okay, ladies and gentlemen, function signatures in Perl. This is a talk which is supposed to be on Friday. And apparently I don't have enough signatures in my brain to map a schedule under the weekly schedule. So what's the situation today? Perl was lacking function signatures for an eternity. In 5.20 we have now an experimental feature for signatures. Perl6 is defining a very powerful signature syntax, and 5.20 is far behind it. It's experimental, and it's not compatible to 6, and CPAN has additionally a zoo of alternatives. So Perl6 has many answers to the question how to define signatures, but Perl6 is totally incompatible to Perl5. And we have an evolutionary gap between the two languages. And the question around my talk is how to fill this signature gap. So what are function signatures? Look at this example. I'll show you here in the signature at the top, and it is more or less what you see on the bottom. This is more or less a syntax which is now in 5.20. You can define variables in the signature, and you get the behavior downside. So why only now? The reason why Perl5 was lacking signatures for such a long time was that it was the syntax was blocked by prototypes in a way. At the place where we normally in other languages put in the signatures, the variable names, we have the prototypes. And the problem was to find a way how to map the signatures into this gap without the breaking backwards compatibility to the other features. The terminology for signatures is vast, and in order to give you a nice overview about the possibilities, I will have a mixed attempt. So what I will do is I will show you the features in 5.20, then I will contrast them to the features in 6, and show you what the CPAN offers and my own attempts. I hope to address different needs, to give you a good overview about the subject, to show you the concept in a good defined way, and to have maybe for the one or other of you who wants to use one of these approaches to have a good tutorial and a grounding for further discussions. So, prerequisites. The new signatures come from 5.20 on only. They are activated by a feature, pragma, which is called, and you have to put those use feature and no warnings experimental signatures. And it's still the case today that you have to activate the feature and you have to deactivate the warning. If you don't deactivate the warning, you get warning subroutine signatures are experimental. The feature may be modified or removed in future versions of Perl. That is at least the state I know from 5.24. Maybe they change it to 5.26, but I don't think so. They offer positional parameters. After you have activated the signatures, you can say you want 2 positional parameters. The first one is left, the other one is right. And this is almost equivalent to what you see on the downside with old standard Perl. Can you see it's almost equivalent? Can someone tell me what the difference is?
If you run through with 3 arguments, then it gives an error.
Exactly. The 2 arguments are mandatory. If you run it with only 1 argument, or you run it with 3 arguments, you get a warning. So it counts the number of the arguments. That's the part I showed you here. Then it assigns to left and right the values, and then it runs the body. And this is actually exactly how it is implemented. If you run it through BD parse, you will see this code. more or less. But yeah, quite exactly. I didn't say all the use statements would appear. So the other feature is you can assign default values, and default values are closely coupled to the concept of optional parameters. If you assign a default value to one variable, this variable is not mandatory anymore, it's optional. If you want to have an optional parameter, you have to assign a default value. It makes sense. And as a side note, undef is always a valid value. It doesn't mean that it's missing. It's still in the list. And of course, you can't start to have positional parameters after you have an optional value. So then you have the possibility, of course, to have an unlimited number of arguments. It's still possible. You have to have a slurping variable, which is at the end. And you have two possibilities to define a slurping variable. You can have it with an @ sign or with a % sign. So it means it's an array or it's a hash. And if it's a hash, it will check if the number of arguments are even, because it expects the key value pairs.
It doesn't have any effect on.
Sorry, but I don't have much time. Can we put the question for later? If you need time to phrase it, so. Sorry, it's okay? Good. So, what time is it now? Perfect. Yeah. So, it has another feature, nameless parameters. These are these are nice to have features. I don't really know if I really necessarily need them, but they are nice to have. If you have an old API and you're calling a subroutine with 3 parameters, you don't need a parameter anymore. You don't need to assign a name anymore. You can say just $, and it will be ignored in a way, but you can still find it in @_ or as a positional parameter. Then you can have dynamic values. This is another thing where I say it's nice to have, but I don't know if I really necessarily need it. You can have, for example, you can say that one argument is the default value for the other argument. So if the nick is missing, it will take the first argument. And you can have close-over arguments. This means you can have a default value which is automatically incremented for each call. If you see the implementation with the eval Perl code, you understand how it's implemented. And now the deficiencies in 5.20 are, which bugs me a lot, there are no named parameters implemented. So you still need to go the old way. You take a hash and you assign them here. And consequently, you don't have default values for named parameters. You have to go you still need the old tricks with mapping hashes on hashes with default values which are overwritten and so on. So consequently, you don't even have mandatory named parameters. If you say the name parameters has to be there, the other one is optional, more tricks needed. So at this point, you have to resort to the old standard. Here are some references if you want to inform yourself. The Perl doc, of course, and Brian Foy wrote a nice blog about subroutine signatures. So I think I'm good in time now. Too fast? It's okay? Good. So now Perl6. Perl6 has the similar semantics for positional arguments. You can assign them default values, and it's the same semantic. As soon as you assign a default value, it becomes optional. Additionally, you have a question mark as a sign for an optional value, so there's more than one way to do it. You can choose which way you do it, and you have to care for yourself if you are contradictory, so you will get an error message. It has slurping arguments. And Perl6 has 2 kinds of slurping arguments, because this is something Perl5 couldn't possibly do, because it can take arrays or hashes as slurping arguments, which means there's a very deep difference to Perl5, because in Perl6 pairs are a data type. So you can have key value pairs. And in Perl5, if you put something in the function call, it's just flattened to a list. So if you put a hash inside a function call, it's just a flat list and not a collection of pairs. So beyond the features of 5.20, you have named arguments, which are indicated by the colon syntax. So if you have a colon, it says, number and prop must be names indicating what value to pass. I have to say, I chose syntax for Perl6, which is valid Perl6, but I chose a syntax which is close to Perl5. There are other possibilities to do it in Perl6 too. I didn't want to confuse you because it's more about the semantics and not about the syntax of Perl6. So of course, order doesn't matter. Exclamation mark is for mandatory. Others by default optional. And this is a thing which bugs me also, because here the thing is to turn around. It's exactly the opposite way. While positional parameters are mandatory by default, name parameters are optional by default. So here you have to mark the mandatory elements by an exclamation mark. And you lose this nice coupling between default values and optional arguments. If you say, I don't know how Perl6 reacts if you have a name parameter which has a value, a default value, and is marked as mandatory. That's contradictory. So I should check if it is throws an error. Named arguments can be mapped on internal names. This means you can call a function with a name number is 5, and internally it's mapped on another variable like incarnation. And you can even use this shortened syntax outside in the call. This is not really necessary for the signatures, it's just nice to know. You can have a variable number, and you can call the doctor with the number in this way, in the classical way. Or if you make a colon, it expands it to this classical way. So it takes the variable name as a name of a named variable. Perl6 has even more features which are very nice. It has constraints. Constraints means you can assign a type, maybe a built-in type or a user-defined type to a variable, and the variable is checked on call. So now hello Joe will work because it's a string, but hello3 will generate a compile time error. And you can pass restrictions with where clauses. In this case, only odd values are accepted because the where clause does a modulo 2 and is only true if it's an odd value. Further on, Perl6 has multi-subs, which is also a very nice feature, which is essentially it's an elegant case switch on call level. This means you pass different styles of argument to a function, and depending on the pattern of these arguments, other function bodies should be executed. In this case, you have even, odd even, a function odd even, and in the first, it checks in the first case if it's an odd value. In the second case, it just says it's an even value. So the first case, if you pass an odd value, the first function will trigger. Otherwise, it will check if there are other multifunctions and go on. That's very nice. It makes a very nice way to implement recursive functions, for example. Here you see a minimal implementation for Fibonacci, which is a recursive function which calls itself. And if it comes to 1 or 2, you have the initialization of Fibonacci. So, references. You can go to Perl6 docs, you can go to the synopsis, but be careful with the synopsis because they were written long ago and some stuff has changed in the meantime. Oh, 20 minutes already. So, on CPAN you have a real zoo on signature implementations. I call them now all signatures, but you have so many namespaces on CPAN are full with different modules like signatures, parameters, arguments, args, params. Just look through CPAN, you can take bets how many modules you will find. It shows in a way how deep the anger was, how the need was for signatures in Perl5. It's so many modules about signatures that we are getting a real shortage of available names. If you want to release a new module, you don't know how to name it anymore. And I will show you a totally unrepresentative selection covering signatures. There is one called attribute signatures. Sounds good. But it just allows you to define a called signature, which means you can define type constraints and type constraints. That's all. It doesn't do mandatory or optional arguments, and has a dependency on attribute handlers. So nothing for us. The next one, subsignatures from Curtis. It's based on filters simple and sub up level. Quite heavy dependencies and covers only positional arguments, no named arguments, but offers multi-methods. Then you have method signatures, which does type constraints. But it does quite a lot of stuff, but it depends on devil declare and PPI. Devil declare has a long list of caveats because it's hooking itself into the parser and trying to parse the code itself. And PPI is known for well, let's say a little bit of slowness. Then you have signatures. Subroutine signatures with no source filters. It uses bhooks and XS loader. Has only positional parameter so far, but it's blocking the namespace signatures lowercase, so it's blocking the namespace for any pragma which can ever come. Then function parameters. You see, I don't reinvent the wheel, so I wanted to see, is there anything on CPAN I can learn about or can take advantage from? It defined functions and methods with parameter lists. And function parameters from Lukas, or Mauke, he's here if you want to talk to him, is quite good. It's very close to Perl6 features. And it has a dependency on pluggable keys. So pluggable keys was introduced with 5.12, but he told me he needs at least 5.14 because some features were added later. And you see you can have positional parameters, you can have default values, you can have methods, which means self is automatically mapped. It has it's very large, and I'm trying to trigger Lukas that he gives a talk about it. He says probably he will give a lightning talk on it because I couldn't test it really. I just know the documentation, so I can't give a really good recommendation for it. One thing which is different to Perl6 is that options need a default value. So the thing which is different in Perl6 is done again differently in function parameters. If you have a named argument which is optional, it needs a default value, and this is the vice versa. So you don't need the exclamation marks or the question marks. Okay, now my own attempt. I like pure Perl solutions because all the solutions you saw had heavy dependencies or were dependent on newer Perl versions. Because I still know a lot of people which are blocked on 5.8. Schober, you were in your last job. You were blocked on the old Perl version. I remember.
Yeah.
Which one?
5.8.3.
5.8.3. So there are quite a lot of people in the business which still have to use 5.8, and they can't use all these fancy modules. So this one, params check, is pure Perl, but unsexy, slow, redundant. You have to pass a template with a hash of hashes of what you need. Then you have to pass the arguments, and then it will check it for you. So it's a pure Perl solution, which I like, but it's quite slow. And I try to do this better. And I have to show you my paradigm, my paradigm. My state of my mental state is that I want to have a flexible, backwards compatible solutions. So I want to try to implement things in pure Perl and then augment them step by step and have them compete with each other, and the best one come into core eventually, probably. So subsig has this syntax. And you won't believe it, this is pure Perl and it works. So set is just an ordinary Perl function. The variables are lexicals in the caller scope, which is important because the my declaration worked for the rest of the function body. Many implementations which do re-eval or use attributes and so on have the problem that the function body is already compiled, but they want to introduce the lexicals afterwards, and this doesn't work. This problem is solved here. And set gets aliases to the variables it wants to set. How does it work? When set parses its own at underscore, it sees that 4 arguments passed. And the first 2 are not read-only, the third one is read-only, the fourth is not read-only. So it can tell, oh, the ones which are not read-only must be positionals. At the time it sees a literal, which is read-only, it is labeled. And from there on it expects pairs. Then it sees the defaults, because these variable declarations pass the values into set, and it's available in at underscore. So it sees the first one has no default, the second one has a default. So undef means no default. And the fourth one has a default. The third one doesn't matter because it's a label. And so on. It sees which one are labels because they are read-only. So it sees it must be label called label. And it can see which ones are mandatory or not. This is quite a good result with just a pure Perl implementation. So how does set arrive to map callers arguments to aliases? Set can access the at underscore of the upper caller level. This is not very well known, but it's documented in Perl docs. If you call caller 1 and you look into the debugger namespace, it's mapped to an array called args. So if you say, this is actually the way how carp does the dumping of all the variables in the backtrace. So the values which are passed to, let's go back, to these functions, positional and named with alias, are actually when you call caller 1 in these arrays. So we already passed the template. We know the first two one has to be positionals, and we know after them we have named variables. And set maps them on the aliases. We've seen the first two and the first two and the fourth element in my add underscore are variables, and we map the positions and the named on them with the label names. So, questions so far? Do you believe me that it works?
Well, the DBRs can have some problems with, because it touches things on the stack that could be not ref counted. There are some problems with DBRs in weird situations. You can get to call down.
DBRs?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me later. I have no idea. So maybe I have to include it in the keywords. So, and this model is just a minimal model. We've shown you other stuff which were fancy stuff. It has a syntax potential because this is all pure Perl. I don't need to program a new parser. I can use pure Perl possibilities to extend this. So, for example, if I want to have named sets, so I don't want to repeat my names. I just want to say key. The variable key is named key. Has a label key. The variable value has a variable has a labeled value. I can use another function named sets, and there I have a dependency at the moment to pet walker to get the variable name, but it's possible. Then I can use types. Perl5 has types. If you look in the documentation of you will see that it's already provided that it has types for, I don't know, 15, 20 years already. It was never continued in a way, but it's available. And I just found a way how to get the information, which type was assigned to a variable. Then we have attributes, which could be used to extend the syntax. And we could even pass constraints. We could have a function called where. I'm not sure at the moment if there's already a built-in code where, which could block this, then I have to name it otherwise. And we could put a block into it as a constraint, and then where, of course, has to return some kind of a blessed argument so that subsig knows this is a where clause and not a normal default value. That's pretty near to what we want. But know the problems. Did I know? I think. This is more. Okay, more feature potential. I have orientation. Oh, that's how it works. But beyond this, if we wanted, and these are some things that I really like to have is to have automatic creation of pod documentation. If I have a function already with a signature, why not generate a normed way to see it in the pod how the function is called? Then I would love to have a live introspection into the debugger. When I have a function from somewhere I'm debugging it or I'm using it as a REPL, and I have this function, why not calling some feature and to see introspected what's the signature of this function. And I could use it for IDEs for IntelliSense support. That is, if the code is on the parse live, there's a live parsing of the code, I could have an IntelliSense support so that I can see the signature and expand it by the way. Since all of this is implemented in pure Perl, extensions are easy. It's pretty near to what we want, but well, this is a phrase which I repeated. I think that's an error in the slides, but do you believe me that it's much easier to add all these features now that it's implemented in pure Perl than if it's done in XS, C, or whatever? I mean, I talked to Lukas, just as a side note, how he implemented pluggable keys. And he said he had long conversations with Reini. So you have these dependencies in other people which know the guts and can help you. The obvious problems are, for me at least, are design hell. I've shown you that there are different models with Perl6, 5.20 and CPAN modules, and which model to take. So I tend to break this Perl6 thing that named variables are optional, because it's far easier if you assign a default value and it becomes optional then. So I go Lukas' way. But the bigger problems are speed, because parsing the signature is very expensive. And if you call a function, you don't want to waste 90% of the time to parse the signature. This could be optimized away after the first call by memorizing how the signature is parsed, and then just do the mapping on the values. But there's one thing we can't get away from, is set is always an extra function call, which means I'm calling a function which is called 1 million times, and it's just I don't know, assigning 2 or 3 values, and the set will take 50% of the time already. This is something which is for some people not really acceptable. And at this place we would need a way to inline the code. Does anyone know how many minutes I have left? 10. So at this point we need macros. I have on GitHub only now a module called macro. I want to release it as macro reparse, which needs bd parse and petwalker to expand macros. It's quite a heavy thing, because I have now go into the check block and then parse all the functions which are in a package and look if set was used, and then expand set as macros. If you're interested in the macro thing, I already gave talks about it. Or I could resort to the newer futures. There's this pluggable key has the potential to implement macros. There are various modules from Lukas, Damien, and Toby Inkster. I couldn't list them all. You saw how many troubles I had to list all the signature modules already on CPAN. But it's quite heavy because it goes into the internals, and well, it needs some mental strength. And there's one new idea I got when I was preparing this talk. And this is actually my main problem when I'm preparing a talk, which each slide I have 10 new ideas, and 3 out of them are good. And I unfortunately don't have the discipline to stop thinking about the new ideas and continue the slides. But I realized that use is actually a poor man's macro. Because what's a use? If you do a use, you execute it at compile time and you call the import. And the import method can inject code via source filter. It's a minimal invasive, I don't know how to pronounce it, Damien?
Invasive.
Invasive.
That sounds right.
Invasive.
Invasive.
Invasive, man.
So a minimal invasive. In the course of my life, I learned 8 languages, and I tell you, the pronunciation of English will always bug me. So, in German, invasive. It's a minimal invasive because it's just introducing one line as a source filter. And maybe I could use pluggable keys or so to just abstract it away. So I could create a library, a dynamic library called set, and make use set, and it does exactly with the same API, the same Perl API, what I wanted, inject the code, and this will all happen at compile time and be fast as hell. I'm not sure about it now because I didn't have the time to test it without risking the slides. So, coming back to my feature design strategy, I hope you see now the idea. I implemented this function signatures thing with a pure functional solution, which with a lot of sugar, and it works somehow. I mean, was it kind of intuitive for you? And we can speed it up later on with macros. If it works with macros, we can speed it up with XS. If it works with XS and we have several solutions, we can decide at the end to do it into core. Then the another approach, this is more an evolutional approach than the one we do at the moment, that we do kind of intelligent design. We add a feature and 3 versions later, it's already deprecated. And you use it in old code, and then you are, what happened now to push? What was it called? Dereferencing of arrays, and so deprecated again. And you have I don't dare anymore to use new features in Perl, because I'm not sure if they're deprecated again. And I'm wondering why the 520 signatures are still experimental. So benefits of this design strategy is it's transparent for the masses. I don't have to know any C or XS. I don't need to find the phone number of Reini or someone else. I don't need to talk a lot with P5P because it's not going into core directly. Have fast prototyping and production testing without deprecation risk. And immediate return of investment. I have to accept it's by far not as attractive and sexy like the implementation from Lukas, but it works somehow. And if you need to write code which works with the Perl versions earlier than 5.14, it might be a good solution. Because evolution is not linear. This image is actually wrong. Because the idea behind it that there is a straight line of evolution. And we always say we are the peak of the evolution. This is because we're standing on the peak, we're looking back. This is not how evolution works. We don't know if we are the peak of the evolution. We don't know if we are the peak of this planet. And it was never a linear thing. Then we had branches, and sometimes the Neanderthals were interbreeding with the other Homo sapiens. So what we need is a way to have a lot of varieties in our solutions to find, to design a Perl5 which is more competitive. Thank you. Questions?
So the question I was going to ask before, prototypes have gone, have they? Or will that syntax conflict with the new signatures syntax in Perl5?
With the prototypes?
Yes.
They solved it.
Okay, right.
They found a way to say if you just have $1, it has the same meaning in both interpretations. If it's a signature or if it's a prototype. And if it's not just $1, you go on. And I think, yeah, with signatures, you had unnamed variables, and it's not allowed to have just one unnamed variable or something like this. Or I don't remember it straight enough, but you know what I mean. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on Cavalca?
What?
Cavalca.
I think I heard the name before.
Toby Inkster's module.
No. What does it do?
Signatures.
And how is it called?
Cavalca.
And what's the relation between this name and signatures?
Nothing.
It solves the namespace problem.
So, so actually, sorry, I didn't do all the images for this talk, but with don't reinvent the wheel for CPAN, I want to show a dump full of wheels, because I didn't even know about Cavalca because I couldn't find it with the usual suspects like a signature, parameters, arguments, args, and params. And I really passed these namespaces, believe me. No, I have not. How is? Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, it compares favorably with Nameless module.
Okay.
I think it even has some more features on top.
Is he here?
I don't believe Toby's here.
Okay, maybe I will see him on her workshop. Okay, more questions? Thank you.